From meeting and working with 3 presidents as mayor, to cliffhangers about floods, famous people, near disasters, and encounters with a ton of interesting characters, this is Tales from the Gem City with former Mayor Chuck Scholz. Join us for this reoccurring bonus segment. I'm History A Go-Go's host, Rob Mellon. Welcome back, Chuck.
Hey, it's great to be back, Rob.
Today we have one of our most important Quincians, Father Augustus Tolton, from a slave family to the very first African-American Catholic priest for an organization that goes back a few thousand years. That's kind of saying something.
It really is, and a saint that walked among us. We have never had a canonization from our Diocese of Springfield, and neither has the Diocese of Jefferson City, which would include Brush Creek, Missouri, where Father Tolton was born and baptized. I believe the last one in Chicago, and this is under the Archdiocese of Chicago since Father Tolton died in Chicago, was Mother Frances Cabrini, and that was 1926. So it doesn't happen very often.
Yeah, no question at all. So maybe give us a little overview of what you know about Father Tolton's life. I know that he was born in 1854, and that year's a pretty momentous year because in 1854, you got the Kansas-Nebraska Act. A few years before that, you had Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin and the Dred Scott case is a few years after his birth. So he's growing up right in the midst of that antebellum period in American history where tensions are really rising.
Absolutely. If you think about it in terms of Quincy in 1854, Lincoln's coming over to speak on behalf of his friend Archibald Williams, who's running for Congress, and to speak out on the Kansas-Nebraska Act in opposition. So while that's happening on one side of the river, on the other side of the river, not far from Quincy, in northeast Missouri, where there was a significant slave population, you have the birth of little Gus Tolton, who was born to the Elliott family in Rawls County, Missouri, in a place called Brush Creek, which is pretty remote. And they were Catholics, and even though they were slave owners, they had their slaves baptized. So it's a little bit incongruous for us in the 21st century, but that's the way they were. There was his father, Peter Paul, had been born and raised, I understand, in northeast Missouri. His mother was born and raised as a slave in Kentucky and was given to Mrs. Elliott as a wedding present and got into a boat and had to come up the Mississippi, and like so many others up the Salt River into northeast Missouri. There were quite a few Catholics, many of them Irish, in the Monroe City, Missouri area, and still are today. You know, Monroe City's not a very big town, but they have a brand new Catholic school in Monroe City, about a $6 million school that they built, I understand, without any debt. So it's still active, and the Monroe City Parish over there takes care of the little chapel at Brush Creek, which is a beautiful stone chapel that looks like you're in Ireland when you come across it. And that is where twice a year they had Mass in honor of Father Tolton. So Father Tolton is born in the 1850s. When the Civil War breaks out in 1861, his father escapes from the farm and goes to sign up to fight for his freedom, to fight for the Union cause. We sort of lose track of him, but he apparently died in Arkansas of dysentery, which, as you know, Rob, killed a lot of soldiers and civilians in that time period. So he's basically never heard from as far as the mother Tolton and these 3 offspring. She decides also to try to escape, and by following the creeks, which are going to lead them to the Mississippi River, hiding out during the day, traveling at night with these 3 children, Father Gus, young Gus, and his brother and sister. When they get to Hannibal, which, of course, now we're into the Civil War, and as you know, Missouri's a border state, and there are some Union troops in Missouri. We know General Grant came through Quincy to quell some of the rebel uprisings in Missouri. So you had rebels and you had Union troops both. And in Hannibal, the story is that some of the Union folks, in sympathy for the Toltons, directed them to a little rowboat, apparently with only one oar. I don't think that they had any idea of really how to get across the river, but they started rowing. But the story goes that then Confederate sympathizers realized that they were escaping and actually shot at this boat. So if you can imagine, this would be great cinema, but here's this heroic woman with her 3 children in a rowboat trying to row across the Mississippi River, going across the river to freedom while being shot at. So it's really dramatic. They get to the Illinois side and head up to Quincy, knowing that there was a good chance of finding some sort of refuge there. And indeed, they were taken in by Quincyans initially at St. Boniface, which is where it is now at 7th and Main Street. Of course, a different structure. Mrs. Tolton found work at the local cigar factory. We rolled a lot of cigars in Quincy in those days. So they unfortunately encountered prejudice at St. Boniface in the school as well as the church. And, you know, Rob, in those days, we had 2 big Catholic churches a block away from each other because at 7th and Main, we had St. Boniface, and the services there were in German.
Right.
At 8th and Main, we had St. Peter's, initially known as St. Lawrence O'Toole, changed to St. Peter's, but that, of course, was the English church for the Irish in Quincy. And they found refuge at St. Peter's because Pastor Father Peter McGirr, great man who ended up being the mentor to Father Tolton, announced to the whole parish that there will be no prejudice against the Toltons. It will not be tolerated. And he welcomed them not only to church, but to the school. And little Gus did very well. His schooling was somewhat intermittent because he also worked at the tobacco factory himself, even though he was just a kid. But he did extremely well in school. The Sisters of Notre Dame, School Sisters of Notre Dame, that we've had in Quincy for over 150 years and still operate Quincy Notre Dame High School. They noticed that Gus was extremely bright and interested, and so did Father McGirr. And Father McGirr had him serve Mass, gave him some work as maintenance around the church, and just in general encouraged him. And at some point in his schooling, it became obvious to Father McGirr that he needed to get out to St. Francis Academy, which we now know as Quincy University, but at that time still operated as it is today by the Franciscans. And the Franciscans took him in and decided that this young man should be a priest. And that was his calling. He knew he wanted to pursue it, but unfortunately no seminary in America would accept Gus Tolton because he was black. So the Franciscans prevailed upon their provincial general in Rome, the head of the entire Franciscan order, and said, we have a young man here who wants to be a priest. And so they admitted him to the Propaganda Fide, which is the seminary in Rome for missionaries. And Gus understandably thought that he would be a missionary and be assigned to Africa. He studied Swahili and other languages and dialects, and he attended class with seminarians from all over the earth, from the Orient, from South America, from all parts of the globe. It's a long process, and fortunately he was good in Latin already, thanks to the Franciscans at Quincy University, but it was a long 6-year process for him, and eventually he was ordained at St. John Lateran Church at his first Mass at St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. And he thought he would be assigned to Africa, as I said, Rob, but this Italian cardinal made this comment that America thinks it's the most enlightened place on earth. Let's see how they deal with the black priest. And he said, I'm going to send you back to, not only to America, but back to Quincy, Illinois.
Right, yeah.
You know, remember, when he left, he thought he would never see his mother or brother and sister again. So he comes back to Quincy. It's quite a deal. He's met by 5,000 people at the train station. His first Mass in the United States is then at St. Boniface because it was the biggest church in town. and it could not accommodate everybody. There was a huge overflow crowd because this man was not only a curiosity of having an African-American priest, the only African-American priest, but you have to understand Father Tolton was a very charismatic individual, had a tremendous speaking voice, was known for his sermons, is known for his singing, had a great singing voice, and people were attracted to him. So he was assigned St. Joseph's Parish at 7th in Jersey, which was supposed to be a mission of St. Boniface outreach to the Black community. Because as you know, Rob, now we're post-Civil War, and we have quite a few African Americans from Northeast Missouri that have moved into Quincy because of the job opportunities in factories in Quincy. So Father Tolton is pastoring this little church. So now we have three Catholic churches within a block. St. Boniface, St. Peter's, and St. Joseph's. Now, I think it was Martin Luther King that said the most segregated hour in America is Sunday morning at 10 o'clock. And that was certainly true in Quincy. But what happened because of Father Tolton's dynamic, charismatic presence is white people wanted to come and hear him. My own great-grandfather, Adam J. Scholz, would go and spend the weekends with his grandparents who lived at 7th in Jersey, right across from St. Joseph's Church. They had a winery. They had vineyards up at Warsaw, very reminiscent of the Rhine, the soil and the limestone up there. And then they would make the wine and sell it at 7th in Jersey. And his grandmother would try to get him to go up to St. Boniface like a good little German boy. But instead, he would disobey and sneak across the street to hear Father Tolton. And there were so many white people that it engendered the jealousy of Father Weiss at St. Boniface. And he was very upset that he was losing probably collection dollars as well as congregants to this Black priest. And he complained to the bishop about it. He said it was only supposed to be a mission to Blacks, and now he has all these white people. And so and the bishop caved in and complied and said, all right, well, I'll send him to Chicago because there's a huge need with the migration going on that we need a Black priest in Chicago. So that's sometimes characterized as Father Tolton left Quincy because of prejudice. I tell people he was reassigned from Quincy not because he was unpopular, he was too popular. And it was really, that's what triggered it. So he gets to Chicago and commences his ministry up there on the south side of Chicago at St. Monica Parish. And he dies as a young man during a heat wave, ministering to the poor on the streets of Chicago. He actually collapsed right on the street. I've stood at that spot. At that point, Father Tolton belongs to the ages, as they said of Lincoln, but that was 1897. So in 1997, the citizens of Quincy, under the leadership of Father Roy Bauer at St. Peter's Church, decided to have a celebration of the life of Father Tolton. It was quite a deal. We had a number of community celebrations, put up the marker at 7th in Jersey, and at the celebratory mass, there were 6 bishops there, and the bishop that gave the homily, Bishop Wilton Gregory, is now soon to be Cardinal William Gregory, and he is the Archbishop of Washington, D.C. He's African American, and that's why we chose him to give the homily. And he, of course, has been a leader in this. So in 2010, then Cardinal George in Chicago opened the cause for sainthood. As I mentioned, he died in Chicago, so you have to open the cause there. I was there. It was a beautiful, elaborate, somewhat medieval ceremony. They impaneled the what used to be called the Devil's Advocate. Right. It's these learned historians who have to be skeptics and question everything that is purported about this individual. And this is quite a long process, Rob, but in essence, what happens is they developed what's known as a Positio, 5,000-page of documents, similar to a doctoral dissertation on the life of Father Tolton. because the church requires all of this historical background. And then that is submitted to Rome and that has been done. So that was in 2010 when it was open. In 2011, in June of 2011, Cardinal George, who's since passed away, but said before the end of his life that the most important thing he did as Archbishop was to open the cause for sainthood. He wanted to come to Quincy, and he did. And he actually went to over into Rawls County to Brush Creek, went on the old Elliott farm, met those folks, went to the little chapel, came back to Quincy, and of course, he wanted to go to the burial site. Father Tolton is buried in Quincy because that was his specific request, that he be returned to Quincy. And upon his death, another huge crowd met his corpse at the train station. They sang, "Holy God, we praise thy name." That was his favorite hymn. And he's buried under this large cruciform right next to Father McGirr at St. Peter's Cemetery at 33rd and Broadway. So the Cardinal went there along with Bishop Joseph Perry, who's the postulator of the cause. He is an auxiliary bishop in Chicago, an African-American, and has been a tremendous leader of this whole movement for canonization. And there were a number of other priests there, and one particular seminarian who asked that they pray to Father Tolton. You know, the miracles that are sought for an individual that's being considered for sainthood are prayers of intervention. So this young seminarian had a classmate at Mundelein Seminary who had been lifting weights in the gym and collapsed. Mundelein is somewhat isolated. By the time the emergency response got there, he was not responsive and never came out of it, and had been in a coma for 40 days, and they were getting ready to discontinue the life support. And so he requested of the Cardinal that they pray to Father Tolton for his intervention on behalf of his classmate. And of course they did. And while they were praying, a priest from Springfield took a digital picture. So it has the date and time while they're praying. So they pray for this young man. They get done at the cemetery. They go a few blocks away to St. Peter's Church, where we have a statue of Father Tolton outside the school. And when they got out of the car, this seminarian checked his phone, checked his text, like all young people do, and he had a text that said, "Matthew woke up." So the long and short of this is that seminarian woke up out of a 40-day coma, and the medical records in Chicago, where he was in the hospital, marked the same time as is displayed on that picture of the bishop and priest praying at Father Tolton's grave here in Quincy. It's a very well-documented miracle. That was in June of 2011. In November 2011, my wife and I were in Chicago attending a fundraiser for Father Tolton's Cause for Sainthood. I hate to tell you, Rob, but it costs money because we have to, you have to translate everything into Italian. You have to have court reporters transcribe it and so forth. So we were attending this fundraiser, and I saw the young man, the seminarian, who'd asked that because I know him. His uncle is our parish priest, and actually he's a priest here in Quincy now. So he came over to our table, and I said, "Hey, Father Bauer told me what happened with your classmate waking up. How is he? Is he still in the hospital? Is he still bedfast? I mean, how's his recovery?" And he said, "He's perfectly fine. Why don't you come over to my table and we'll meet him?" So I have met this young man who's now a priest in Wisconsin who experienced this miracle. So that was in 2011. But the timetable on canonization, as I mentioned, they opened the cause in 2010. In 2011, they had the formal ceremony, and that's when the Cardinal came here and the miracle occurred. And then we've gone through this process of having Father Tolton declared venerable, which means that he has led a life of heroic virtue. And I think if you think about someone being born a slave and becoming a Catholic priest after being educated in Rome and accomplishing everything Father Tolton did, that certainly is a life of heroic virtue. That occurred just this past June 11th of 2019. Pope Francis issues a declaration stating that Father Tolton had lived a life of heroic virtue and advanced him to Venerable Father August Tolton. Once you get to Venerable, that's when they can consider the miracles. You need one miracle to be beatified. The second, you become canonized as a saint of the church. So now this is under consideration, and we're very hopeful that within the next year or so, this miracle, and there are other miracles. There are 12 miracles that I'm aware of. There's another one that's very well documented from a woman in Florida whose entire family prayed just concertedly for a miracle. She was going to have her leg amputated. It was gangrene, and the gangrene reversed itself, which apparently there's no medical explanation for. And that's sort of the definition of a miracle,
right?
If there's no medical explanation. So I really think we're going to have a beatification of a Quincean, and following that, a canonization, Rob. And it's really going to be a very significant thing for Quincy. And we're hopeful that St. Boniface Church at 7th and Main will become the shrine of Father Augustus Tolton. And perhaps his remains he'll be disinterred and moved into St. Boniface. The remains have been exhumed once as part of this process because the church requires actual physical, historical documentation that this person existed.
Yeah, I actually went through that. You can find that on the Diocese website. And I went through it, and it goes minute by minute, and it talks about what happens in the exhumation. It's really interesting when they encounter different things. They encounter handles from the casket. They encounter pieces of the crucifix.
Yes, buttons from the cassock and so forth. And they had a forensic team there, medical examiner, anthropologist, because they had to determine that it was, in fact, Father Tolton. And then, as you may have seen, I don't know if this is on the website, Rob, but of course they've had licensed morticians participate in this as well. And they actually take the skeletal remains and put new vestments on.
They do. They do say that in there, and it's really interesting, that entire process. And the reason why it takes as long as it does is because the process is so, like you said, we don't have the devil's advocate anymore, but they're very skeptical of everything.
Yes.
Everything has to be verified actually by science.
Absolutely.
As you mentioned, you had forensic people there during the exhumation, but also during the miracles. There has to be, and you referenced this, there has to be no medical explanation for a recovery. And only after that, and they have medical professionals that go through it as well. So there's a scientific piece that I don't think people quite understand about canonization.
Right. And, in the past, there were saints of the church that, did they really exist? Was it a myth that St. Christopher carried people across the river and so forth? It's hard to go back and establish that. But Father Tolton, he has been under complete scrutiny. And this Positum, this 5,000-page document, has been examined in very minute detail. And that, I believe the exhumation was December of 2016. And then again in 2018, they approved this Positio and all of the history to document it. And then it was February of 2019 that they recommended to the Pope that he be declared venerable. And then, of course, we got that on June 11th of 2019. So we're, in terms of the church moving, this has been lightning fast to have 10 years. There's people that it takes hundreds of years for canonization. So, and there are other Americans under consideration, but an article I was reading in National Catholic Review, it had all the other people, and then it had Father Tolton got his own page. I think everyone is really anxious to see this happen. And we have about 2 million African-American Catholics. And, growing up, I went to St. Peter's School, so of course I knew about Father Tolton, and I had the family history. I knew my great-grandfather who had met Father Tolton, but I didn't think anybody else in the world had ever heard of Father Tolton. But when we started this process back in 1997 to celebrate his life, we had people come from all over the country. That night we had a choir from Memphis, Tennessee. We had Tolton Society members from New Orleans. We had people from Washington. Of course, in Chicago, I've been to several Tolton events that are extremely well attended in the African American community in Chicago, which has a Father Tolton Society as well. They just received a $1 million grant, $200,000 a year for the next 5 years, to work in the Black Catholic community in Chicago to enhance and preserve the legacy of Father Tolton. I think in terms of historic tourism, we would have many, many thousands of people from around the country that would want to come to Quincy to the shrine after we get it established. And certainly we need educational interpretive center to be able to explain the significance of Father Tolton's life. But he did lead a life of historic virtue and was well loved simply as a humble Catholic priest. But I should emphasize that once he got to Chicago and people were aware of his talents and ability, he was sent all over the country to speak. Mother Catherine Drexel, who I think is either beatified or perhaps a saint from Philadelphia, she was a wealthy woman, the Drexel family, well known, and she sponsored a lot of Catholic missionaries, but she was very close with Father Tolton. There's extensive correspondence with Catherine Drexel and Father Tolton, and so she would pay to send him around the country to speak because he was such a wonderful, wonderful speaker, was known for his tremendous speaking ability and sermons. And as I mentioned before, apparently had a great singing voice as well. So his legacy lives on, and Quincy is a huge part of that. And of course, it fits into our overall city of refuge, where we had the Underground Railroad, but we also helped the Potawatomis and the Mormons and really all those immigrants that built our community in the 19th century.
Yeah, no question about that. Some things that struck me about Father Tolton, and you talked about a few of them, how he starts work when he's 8 or 9 years old. That's younger than most slaves would start work on a plantation. So he was a hardworking person from just a boy. And, that was one aspect of it. And then how people took to him, even at a young age and as he's working. He also worked at the Flynn bottling or soda water manufacturer.
That's right.
And so he had some connections. When they had his funeral in town, that was a big event.
Huge.
And people were very saddened.
Yeah.
There was one aspect to that in 1897. There was a massive heat wave. It seems odd when you hear it today. Why does a 43-year-old person die of heat stroke? Seems odd. But all kinds of people died throughout the Midwest, including in Quincy. So when I was going through it, I was looking at the newspaper articles. It was saying 2 more people died today. And they were doing something very similar to Father Tolton. Maybe they were overworking themselves, didn't stop their activities, and they succumbed to the heat right there. And he falls to the ground. I think it was at 36th and Ellis Avenue.
Yes.
So if somebody wants to go to Chicago, if you go to 36th and Ellis Avenue, that's where Father Tolton and people were around, and they indicated what happened. He collapses to the ground and he's not revived. That was not uncommon in 1897. Several people who had succumbed, and I kind of hearkened back to his youth when he's such a hardworking person that when it's 105 or 10 degrees outside, he doesn't change his activities, as you said, ministering to the poor and the people of Chicago, and he just succumbed to the heat. Those are a few aspects. But here's the pallbearers. Here's where the pallbearers at his funeral in Quincy: J.B. Minke, Jerry Shea, Father McGirr, Fred Schulteis, J.J. Flynn, John Hellick, J.H. Neal, and S.J. Bowers. Those were the the pallbearers for Father Tolton.
And that's a blue ribbon Quincy group, isn't it? That's very interesting. Yes. And, the Flynns are still here in Quincy, descendants. I have heard other stories about Father Tolton attending a wedding reception and very humbly, as the Bible says, you take the seat at the back and being called up to the head table and so forth because of the affection, the family, which is not to say that there wasn't prejudice, and there was prejudice with the Catholic priest at St. Boniface, but there were wonderful people like Father McGirr who just went above and beyond to champion him because clearly, as you said, Rob, even as a young student, they recognized something special about this man and the gift that he had and that, he had a calling.
Well, for a boy who comes from that environment of a slave plantation where education is not even allowed in most cases, some of them snuck education or were taught education without the owner knowing. But the reality is someone from that environment so quickly picking up, he learned German, for example. He could speak German. And so those are just a few things. And then he becomes, when he goes to Quincy University, which you said, of course, was St. Francis at the time, they realize he's well above all the other students. And that is what kind of prompts them to say, well, we need to push this individual along. He has special gifts. Those are some amazing things about Father Tolton.
And he loved Quincy, and that's why he requested that he would be buried in Quincy. And we recently, about a year ago, came across an artifact which was a picture apparently taken on the day that he was ordained a priest by an Italian photographer in Rome that probably took the same type of picture of every new priest. And it was in one of those sort of calling card formats with his picture on the front. And on the back, it was a message. And it was sent to the priest who was the head of St. Francis Academy at that time at Quincy College, this Franciscan father who had been instrumental in getting Father Tolton accepted to the seminary in Rome. So this is a little message that he wrote on the back in gratitude. In other words, now I've become a priest and I thank you. He makes a little reference to, you'll notice in the picture, I've been eating really well in Rome. I think he barely put on some pounds. I guess anybody living in Rome for 6 years might, all that pasta. But the basic message is thank you so much, and please tell everybody in Quincy and at the college, that I've graduated and been ordained. And that was someone who had been a custodian at St. John's Parish, had been given that back over 50 years ago. He's an elderly person, and we were able to obtain that, and we have that now in safekeeping. Of course, that's one of the things that would be displayed once we have an educational interpretive center for Father Tolton, which I anticipate will happen here in the next few years, and we should all celebrate the meaning of his life and legacy as Quincyans.
Well, in the time period that he lives, how impactful. We mentioned 1854, and that was the year of the Kansas-Nebraska, and of course his mother escapes during the Civil War, and then the year before he dies in 1897, and Plessy versus Ferguson is in 1896, which establishes separate but equal. So during this time period, to be so beloved when, and as you mentioned, of course, there were all kinds of prejudices and discrimination he had to overcome. That's a true accomplishment. It sounds like a movie to me, Chuck.
Well, they're making a movie, Rob. That individual's been to Quincy. He's got maybe 15 minutes of it that he's trying to sell now for the full-length feature. And it's actually mentioned a couple of prominent actors who are Catholics that have taken an interest in it because, the idea of Martha Jane Tolton rowing her 3 kids across the Mississippi, dodging gunfire from Confederate sympathizers, that's pretty dramatic stuff, as well as you can imagine a young African-American landing in Rome
Right.
In that same time period, or even Chicago in the 1890s. Yeah, there's so much there, and it really is just a very inspirational story for everybody to learn about the life of Father Tolton. Again, I take pride in it as a Quincyan that we were a big part of it, and certainly you know that by his affection for Quincy. And as you said, that funeral involved thousands and thousands of people, and we were reminded when we were in Chicago in 2010 for the opening of the Cause for Sainthood, and it was Father Bauer and Father Joe Zimmerman from Quincy University and myself, and the Archdiocesan choir for the recessional sang, "Holy God, we praise thy name." Well, that was Father Tolton's favorite hymn, and that's the hymn that they sang upon his body arriving back in Quincy. And that Archdiocesan choir is pretty strong, Rob. I'll tell you what, and they had a pretty good organ there, and it was really
pretty moving.
They blew the pipes out on that one. And Father Bauer, God bless him, because during this whole thing, when Bishop Perry, the postulator, got up to take the pulpit, he said, "I have to acknowledge one person." Father Bauer was so humble, but he said, "I have to point out Father Roy Bauer, who's sitting here, and if it was not for his efforts, none of us would be here today." He was the one that always held the torch for Father Tolton, wrote the little biography of Father Tolton. There's a very extensive biography written by a Catholic nun back in the 1930s, but now there's a graphic novel about Father Tolton that we're given to all the school kids. But in any event, Father Bauer, we were all singing "Holy God, we praise thy name," and all this pomp and circumstance. And he turned to me and he said, "They really know how to do it upright in Chicago, don't they?" And it was something to see. And I always told him, "Father, you and I are going to Rome when the canonization takes place," which would probably be in Rome. And unfortunately, Father Bauer's passed on to his reward, but we think of him all the time, especially in regard with Father Tolton. And sometimes the canonizations take place in the native country if the Pope is traveling there.
Okay.
So if he came to America in the next few years, it could be that he would go to Chicago and canonize Father Tolton there. Otherwise, it would be in Rome. But the beatification, which is the next step upon certification of the first miracle, that would probably take place. I asked Bishop Perry if he presides at St. Philip Neri, which is a huge cathedral on the south side of Chicago, and I said, "Would you have it here at your church, Bishop?" And he said, "Beatification would probably be in United Center." So that gives you an idea; it's a very big deal.
That is a big deal.
Yeah,
Michael Jordan,
that size in Quincy.
Michael Jordan, Father Tolton.
There you go.
All right. Well, thanks, Chuck. That's a great story, and of course, more and more people need to know about Father Tolton. The Historical Society, we're going to do our part coming up this spring. We have a major exhibit on the Underground Railroads, Free Blacks, New Philadelphia, and Father Tolton's going to have a major role in that exhibit as well.
Great. It all comes together, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Holly Kane has put together a Father Tolton sites in Quincy, so it would include St. Boniface, St. Peter's, the cemetery, I think where they lived over on 5th and Ohio. Yeah, we're doing more and more to make it easier for people to learn about this great man and the significance of his life. So there'll be more to come.
Well, thanks, Chuck. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Rob. I'll look forward to next time.
I would like to thank Chuck Scholz once again today for an interesting and amazing Tales from the Gem City. If you liked our conversation today, please share the episode with a friend. And remember to subscribe to the podcast. Simply hit the subscribe button on the podcast directory that you use and get new episodes or new Tales of the Gem City immediately after they are released. Subscribing is the only way to get new shows right away. The music was provided by the band Bones Fork, who are producing new music as we speak, and we're looking forward to that. To the growing list of listeners from 40 countries and hundreds of cities across the United States, I would like to say thank you very much. I truly appreciate it. There are many more great episodes on the way and more tales from the Gem City. So join us again next time when we talk, think, and drink on History A Go-Go.
It's time to go home. It's time.